a moment to acknowledge those that are joining us today that are helping to lead this discussion. First of all, thank you to the City of Auburn Hills, the Chamber of Commerce, for helping put this together. To Matt Loria, the CEO of Auxiom Security, to Dani Vanderzanden with Ogletree Deakins, and to Chris Beardslee with Allied Insurance. We appreciate all of you here today and appreciate your insight as we navigate this discussion today. We're going to kind of do this as a Q&A opportunity, an opportunity for me to ask questions of our experts and then have them discuss. And obviously, if you have questions or concerns, kind of keep track of that. And towards the end, we'll give you an opportunity to chime in here. So the questions that will be asked are for all of you to have an opportunity to answer. So as we're working, with the new reality, as I mentioned, of the coronavirus and cybersecurity, let's begin with this first question. Which types of industries are you working with that are showing the most concerns in terms of cybersecurity? And has COVID-19 changed what you are seeing right now? Matt, why don't we start with you?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I mean, we're working with all sorts of industries. I mean, basically, our company serves mostly companies and organizations under $1 billion in revenue. So it can be anywhere from a few million all the way up to $1 billion. And we're really seeing that it's kind of a broadcast of all industries. There doesn't seem to be one industry that's left unsusceptible to these types of attacks. In fact, we're seeing a lot that's gotten worse lately since the COVID, being the phishing attacks, the unemployment scams. So there has been a large uptick, not only in the scams, but also people falling for the scams.
What about you, Dani?
So I would say we are seeing the same thing in terms of it is multidimensional in terms of the industries that are affected. The biggest thing that we are seeing is the unemployment scams, and those are affecting individuals in every industry. And often what happens, there are two ways that companies find out that this has happened. One is that an individual receives some sort of notice from their state's unemployment compensation entity, and they realize I didn't actually apply for unemployment compensation, and so they're alerted in that way. And the other is that the companies are often provided with regular updates from unemployment compensation as to who's making claims for unemployment, and they'll notice that somebody who's actually still actively on the payroll has gotten it. The latest that we've seen is package deliveries, where somebody hasn't actually ordered the package and there's a piece of paper in it for your usual refund or return, and some people have gone on to that and tried to return the package and have had their computer taken over. So it's really hitting everything, and it's not just in your computer, it's paper, it's the phishing through the email, and as I say, the unemployment scams.
And what we've seen at Channel 4, because we've had employees, full-time employees who have not filed for unemployment benefits, is we've seen those letters that appear to be from the state saying that they have applied. And most of our employees, most of the 300 employees that make their way to the building, including HR, are working remotely. We're lucky enough that one day our HR director came in to sort through all the mail and saw the actual printed letters. So, you have to be, unfortunately, aware of all of that stuff right now. Chris, what about you?
So as an independent insurance agency, we create programs around a lot of different industries, and so do the carriers that write cyber insurance products. The demonstration that's on the screen right now is a presentation from one of the carriers, and it really goes across. Here are a lot of exposures for all different industries. I mean, you can see where the construction industry is getting hit with different types of phishing scams, social engineering scams, where they're trying to interrupt the transfer of funds between two entities and take that fund transfer and change the numbers or interrupt it so that it goes to a different bank account and they end up receiving the funds outside of the normal transaction. You can see education, healthcare are two of the major industries that are being attacked right now. But essentially across all industries, we're seeing growth in attacks because of the work at home environment that people have moved to so quickly during COVID.
So then how are you able to help clients right now kind of navigate all of this?
So it really comes down to sitting down and evaluating, similar to what Matt does, what types of changes they're making in their environment and what types of new exposures are being brought by having remote employees. And then discussing what their exposures are and how the policies would interact with trying to protect them and giving them the right limit.
And that's essentially what you do, Matt. You kind of like make people aware of where they could be vulnerable from a security standpoint.
Yeah, so I mean, our way of assisting a client is a few different ways. One way is during or post attack. So just wrapping up, if in fact, Sarah, if you want to go back one slide here, we've seen just more recently a small healthcare company, just a couple person entity was attacked with a phishing attack, and it stole a number of records. Manufacturing company was hit and with about 50 employees. And then we had a retail organization that we came in. These are all post-attack type of work that we've done, coming in and basically regrouping and helping them to bolster their organization so that these things are far less likely to happen. So start off with assessing the situation. So much like a doctor, diagnose before we start prescribing medications, but diagnosing, locking things down, and then building them a program to stop it or do our best to stop it going forward. Because it's much like a security system in a house, right? I mean, you can lock all your doors and windows, have a big dog, have barbed wire, but if somebody does want to get in, they can always tunnel in. They could always parachute in there. If they want in bad enough, they can find a way in. It's what level of protection are you willing to give yourself?
Danielle, what about you?
So we certainly come at it largely from the employee and HR side, although we work regularly with teams like Matt's to help on the information security side, the pure technical side. But even before COVID-19, employees have long been the major source of information exfiltration, whether it is somebody doing something foolish, like clicking on a phishing link, somebody doing something intentional, like stealing trade secrets, somebody doing something accidental, like leaving a laptop in a car, and having failed to provide appropriate protective methods on that laptop, such as encryption and passwords and appropriately delineated passwords. So we work heavily with the legal team and the HR team to ensure legal compliance. Our companies who are subject to HIPAA, for instance, or Gramm-Leach-Bliley, or any of the other regulatory schemes, following what they need to do in order to take appropriate physical, administrative, and technical measures to protect the information. But also, are the employees being trained? Are we keeping them up to speed? And of course, with COVID-19 and the huge move to remote work, we were working with developing policies and practices for employers who were now having to deploy large numbers of their workforce who had not previously worked from home to home work. And as we start to look back towards return to work, we're looking at some of the risks that are associated with individuals coming back to work. So certainly we coordinate with a variety of different teams in order to ensure that companies are being proactive in their steps to try to protect their information.
So then Danielle, following up on that, has COVID-19, has it been a barrier, and what types of barriers are you seeing right now?
So the kinds of barriers that we see, I mean, certainly when the large scale rapid deployment to remote work, there were many employees who companies had never foreseen would be moving into the remote workplace. So they didn't have sufficient assets, from laptops to employer devices to be used. And of course, employees who are using their own device to connect to an employer network provide and a higher or an increased level of risk than someone who is working on a company laptop that has been appropriately configured in order to provide the kinds of protections that are needed. And so we were working actively with teams like Matt's to try to find ways to ensure that we could provide protection, even though it was going to take some time to get additional company resources to deploy those out to the newly made remote workforce. Same sort of thing that you run into with BYOD for people who may have been using their own iPhone or Samsung, whatever. I'm not trying to brand a particular, but their own mobile device. But this is a much larger scale, because obviously the kinds of things that you can access through your home desktop or your home laptop are going to be increased. So that was probably the biggest problem that we saw immediately. And then, of course, the issue of making sure folks have what they need in order to be able to work ergonomically at home. And it's a whole myriad of problems.
Chris, what about from the insurance perspective?
So, I mean, insurance is there to protect you against a catastrophe. So making sure that your insurance policy offers the right coverages is something that's critical in this industry. We've seen policies that don't include devices that are not owned by the business. We've seen callback provisions that would not provide protection for social engineering claims if the employee doesn't call the person they're sending the money to. Well, obviously that eliminates that coverage pretty much, because there is already communication verifying it. So why does that even have a limit on the policy? Being that there's hundreds of different carriers that are in this realm, we've taken the time to analyze and identify the carriers that really can handle the issues that are taking place right now, and providing worldwide coverage so that they can meet the requirements of the EU and other foreign entities should breaches occur that take place over borders.
Matt, I know we've talked about this before, about a lot of companies not thinking that it can happen to them, when in reality it can happen to any individual or to any company. Do you think that most companies have the capability right now to deal with a breach that could cause a lot of problems for the company and their employees?
No, unfortunately, the short answer is no. And actually, to build off something that Chris said, Chris actually taught me something about the insurance business that we often hear from clients, which is we'll hear folks say, well, I have cyber insurance, so why do I need that extra piece of security or whatever it might be? And two things. One, that's not a really good. That's like saying, well, I have a life insurance plan, so who cares if I die? I mean, maybe you can be okay with that. But the other thing that Chris had taught me is that there's sublimits, and there's a lot of caveats in these cyber insurance policies that people try to, rely back on. And right now, with these things not being able to be handled by, or not being handled inside of the cyber policy, they're left kind of naked. And that kind of doves into the question you were asking me too, which is, are they capable of preparing internally or being prepared internally? And the short answer for that, again, is no, because there's the professional hacker is very well versed and is an expert in what they in what they do. The internal folks, unless you have an organization that is in the hundreds of millions of dollars, you typically don't have the budget to really apply to having all the disciplines of IT to be covered in order to really truly be prepared for this. So what I mean by that is that you'd actually have to have a cybersecurity expert on your own staff in order to really truly be prepared to have an even fight with the bad guy who's coming after you. And
the reality is most companies just don't have that. And that's what can make them so vulnerable to such an attack. Danielle, I guess the question is then, what can a company do if they don't have an expert like that working in-house? What can they do to kind of ward off an attack or to prepare for one?
So generally we look at cyber attack principles in three primary buckets. What we call physical barriers to exfiltration, which would be if you've got HR files in a cabinet, make sure the cabinet is locked, make sure the door to the office is locked, and make sure that the door to the building is locked. As Matt noted earlier, you may have all kinds of physical barriers, and that's not going to help you necessarily on the technical side. So you also need administrative and technical barriers, and I will probably defer to Matt to some extent on the technical piece. But on the administrative side, we look at things like multi-factor authentication and password protection and encryption and those kinds of things as ways to make sure that what you are doing is allowing, if you've got somebody in HR, certainly they need access to HR files, but your janitor, of course, does not need access to HR files, or a manager may need access to certain personnel files relating to their team, but they don't need them relating to others. And so you want to make sure that you're giving narrow access. And so in terms of preparing, the teams that are responsible for that, and it's generally, depending upon the size of the organization, it may be one person, it can be the CFO, it can be HR, it can be somebody who's in charge of operations. In a larger organization, generally you'll have somebody who's responsible for privacy and somebody who's separately responsible for information security. You'll have somebody else who's responsible for legal and HR. So depending upon the size of the organization, it's a matter of working with them to determine how best they can deploy the protective mechanisms that they need to deploy in order to be ready if something happens. And if it's a very small organization, we say create your 911 list so you know who to call to put your insurer on notice if there's an issue, who to call about either public relations or legal issues. So you want to work with the organization where they are, as opposed to trying to create a full privacy team for every organization, regardless of size.
And Chris, should companies and organizations be looking at their cyber policy?
Yeah, the things that no experts on your team really, or no team members for your company really have an experience in is like a ransom negotiator. If your system's being held hostage, public relations for making sure that you get the information out, that you had the right protections in place. All of those aspects are covered by a cyber policy and are set up so that there is a response that is immediate, it's cost effective, and it goes across borders, because depending on the state you're in, there's different legal requirements as to how you respond and how a claim is handled by the company and how long you have to do credit monitoring and breach notification to each of the affected parties. So I think you're muted, Hank.
My dog was barking. I apologize. So Matt, I think I know the answer to this question, but your advice or suggestion, should companies be bringing in outside experts to help them kind of navigate all of this?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about before an incident occurs, or yeah, definitely. I mean, there's security tests that can be done on the network and on individual machines to actually see how they would stand up to somebody trying to get in. That's something that, again, typically the discipline doesn't occur in-house, so you can contact they can contact a company like ours, or we work with one of the gentlemen who just commented, Doug Copley, who is former Chief Information Security Officer at Beaumont Health. Doug separately, and then also through us, offers the virtual Chief Information Security Officer role. So you can actually buy that in a fractional way. So so there's opportunities out there to use that type of service for sure.
And Chris, from an insurance perspective, I think it's just a good opportunity, like we all do maybe with our own homeowners or auto and policy, to take a look at what's covered from a business side and what's not, and maybe make some additional changes given the climate that we're dealing with now.
Yeah, with the advent of COVID, we're seeing carriers that are putting new restrictions on their policies. I've mentioned the callback provision, but property owned by the business, the worldwide coverage. We're seeing restrictions on social engineering limits, cyber crime. And for the most part, you're going to find that the US-based carriers have a lot less experience than some of the overseas carriers, and they're putting these restrictions on because they're not prepared for the claims that are going to come through related to cyber. So evaluating the carriers are pretty critical at this time.
Danielle, what do you think?
Well, I think that looking at insurance is a good way to be prepared, and I think there are a number of other external resources that companies need to be ready to pull in the event of a breach. I don't think most of them have the capability internally. And from the legal perspective, we often find that it is advisable, at least in the initial outset, as you're looking at a breach scenario, to bring in legal counsel so that your investigation can be run through counsel in a privileged way. External counsel may also already have relationships with the government authorities who may need to be involved. And we certainly have relationships with people like Matt's team to help on the forensic investigation side of things.
What about Matt, what about the technology disruptors and the cybersecurity changes that are impacting business right now? What are you seeing?
Well, this whole work from home gig has certainly changed things. So, you know, when you think about working in your office, the whole network is basically set up for security. Typically, you know, if a professional has done so. But what happened in this pandemic has been everybody rushed to go work from home, and so utility kind of took over security. And I'm always concerned when I hear the word just. You know, just use your computer at home. It's no big deal. Get online with you know, as quickly as you can. Or just log in directly. Don't use the VPN because everybody's clogging up the VPN. Because if you think about it, your company VPN may have only had 5 people working remote yesterday, but then the day after the pandemic and working from home, it might have 150. So big difference of the resources there. We always find though that there's a technology disruptor out there that we kind of joke about a bit, which is called technology debt, and it seems to be kind of an everlasting thing. If you've seen, you know, you have a roof, right? And then when that roof starts to go bad, it's one cost if you fix it right now, but then if you wait a couple more years and it gets even worse and then infiltrates the wood underneath it, it now costs you, you know, twice as much to replace that roof. And there's a lot of that going on in technology that's kind of been constant. So I don't want to necessarily say it's a disruptor. It's more of a constant out there that people don't always acknowledge what needs to be updated. The other disruptor out there, though, that's probably more what you're looking at for an answer is IoT. And if you've heard of that, the Internet of Things. So maybe at our house, whereas the thermostat 5 years ago was just a dial on the wall, now it's an app on the phone, an electronic device that's on your wall that's hooked up to the Wi-Fi system. Those are just other attack vectors now that are out there. So that's been a big disruptor. And that example that I gave is just something that's in the household, right? But if you think of a machine shop, somebody that might have a CNC machine on their shop floor, whereas that may have never been connected to an outside network. Now those are connected to internal and external networks to provide data. So again, more attack vectors out there where attacks can occur or infiltrations can occur. And those IoT devices are typically less secured than your traditional pieces of IT equipment.
Chris, what about you? What are you seeing?
Matt did a good job summarizing a lot of the IT environment changes. A couple things I'd like to add is a lot of people, one, are using personal emails to handle communication rather than using their company email because they might not be able to log in. Other things that you got to think about that are breaches or incidents, because a lot of these are just incidents, not necessarily a full breach, is you need to include paper in your thought pattern and phone conversations. So we're seeing claims being turned in for people that are paying with credit card over the phone and calling in the credit card number for takeout orders, things along those lines. The employee is taking that information and using it against the customer. We're also seeing a lot more files being put into vehicles and taken home, and the vehicle's either stolen or broken into, and those paper files are considered an incident under a cyber policy. So there would be protection against those types of exposures. And with everyone kind of learning a new way of transferring their data and working on files, there's a lot more of that going on, and we're seeing an influx of claims related to those exposures that are remote, with cell phones, laptops, and paper files.
Danielle?
So I'm going to echo what Matt said, right? I mean, many of our systems were just simply not prepared for the volume of remote work that we're seeing. And so that has been a challenge, because you may be on your VPN and trying to meet a deadline, and something goes down, and in many instances, the people that the companies we represent are very clever problem solvers, and rather than spend an hour and a half on the phone with the help desk trying to figure out a way to get the VPN back up and running, they find a workaround, whether it's forwarding a document to their personal email and working on it that way, or downloading it to a thumb drive, or any one of a number of different methods that you can use to move a document from the company system that is secure to a personal system, which is always going to be less secure. And so that's a big problem. The other is that the volume of email for many people has increased, because you can't just walk next door to the person next door and ask a quick question as a way to deal with it. And so people are trying to get through larger volumes of email more quickly, which makes them more susceptible to some of the hackers and the phishing attacks that are very well socially engineered. And many of them use language that is consistent with the COVID-19 crisis. So in order to get your COVID bucks, just click on this link and do this, or here's a example of how you can test your own symptoms, click on this link. And any of these things can be hackers or phishing scams, ways that folks are looking to penetrate your system. And with people working in a very different environment, or even capitalizing on the fact that many of us are trying to work with children at home, and we may be more distracted and more quickly reacting to things that we're seeing. So there are that one of the challenges isn't, and always has been, that the hackers are working on this stuff full time, and for everyone else it's sort of part of our job, and particularly for employees who are focused very much on something else but trying to be aware of cybersecurity concerns. There are a number of ways that in the midst of COVID-19, those who want to get into your system can capitalize on that and use that as a vehicle for accessing your system. So it's really important for folks to stay on top of good cybersecurity hygiene throughout this process.
Danielle, I'll continue with you then, because tailing off of that is how has cybersecurity changed the face of training?
So cybersecurity and data privacy laws around the country, at least within the US, vary dramatically. For those who've got operations in the EU, you've got GDPR. In many other countries, there is some federal regulatory scheme. There are some in the US. I mentioned HIPAA before. I mentioned Gramm-Leach-Bliley. There are a variety of federal limitations on what one can do with someone else's information, but more and more it is a patchwork quilt around the United States. Everything from the California Consumer Privacy Act to New York's SHIELD Act, which addresses electronic information, to various nuances in the data breach statutes from state to state. And Chris appropriately mentioned that there's a distinction between a data security incident and a data breach, which is specifically defined within these statutes. But the challenge that companies run into is that they need to make a determination. Am I going to focus just on my state? So if I'm in Illinois, for instance, I've got the Biometric Information Privacy Act that I need to comply with. If I'm in Massachusetts, I've got to have, Massachusetts was the first to have a written information security program requirement. So it's kind of a patchwork, and companies can decide. If you're in one state, you can focus on that state. If you're in one substantive specialty, such as healthcare, you can focus on HIPAA. But if you've got operations in a number of different states, then it's really important to look at all of the various nuances in the statutes that apply to your particular business and jurisdiction, and make sure that you're providing your employees with the training that is required pursuant to your program. And this is also coming up in the return to work in terms of COVID. Some companies are using app-based symptom checks or temperature checks and that kind of thing as they come into the workplace. And many states are also requiring specific training to your employees about COVID issues before they're allowed to return to the workplace. So there are a variety of different things that relate to the use of technology and cybersecurity issues where your workforce needs specific training to be compliant with their obligations.
So are there companies that are doing it right, Matt? What companies out there are do you feel that are kind of handling it the right way?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Mostly the companies that we walk into and we see that they're doing things right, they're those that are being held to some sort of security compliance standard. So not saying that happens all the time. There's definitely times where we walk into somebody who's bound by a compliance standard and they tell me, oh yeah, we just click yes on all these boxes and no one's ever checked before. But most of the time, the ones that we see that are right are folks that are held to maybe an ISO 27001 or held to a NIST standard because they're doing business with the government, or a HIPAA standard, or there's other statutes, compliance standards for schools and for financial institutes like FINRA. And those we tend to see that they take it more seriously because they realize that it can shut them down, it can lose them business if they're not doing things correctly. And when they are doing things correctly, usually what it includes is a quarterly or a biannual or an annual security audit by a third party. And then those are the folks that tend to be doing things right.
Chris, what about you?
The customers that we see are doing the most when the carriers are asking questions about systems and the protections they have in place are the ones that are working with the companies like Auxiom that have the right protections in mind and have developed the right software programs to notify them of what's going on and what's coming down the path. Some of the programs that are put in place also include doing some testing and sending out test emails to all the employees over a couple of months to try and evaluate whether they're clicking on links and give reporting on those types of things. But most of those services are already being accomplished by the IT vendors, and that's where we see the companies that are most protected and have thought about where their protection needs to be in place.
Danielle, what about you?
So certainly those companies that have robust internal teams that are working to keep abreast of the legal developments and the technology issues that affect their particular organization are going to be the ones that are handling security most effectively. As Matt said, conducting regular audits, and it's everything from penetration testing on the internal phishing testing to see how employees do, but also providing, at least in the first instance, substantial remedial training so that folks understand how they've made the mistakes that they're making, and those mistakes can be avoided in the future. I'm not saying that you don't ever want to discipline employees who are repeatedly falling prey to these phishing scams, but that the internal training and using, I wouldn't point out, say, Dani failed the phishing test because she did X, Y, or Z, but certainly taking the information that you glean as a result of those internal analyses and devoting some time to delivering that news to the rest of your workforce in a way that is productive will help. The other thing that I would say is that in addition to keeping pace with legal developments and keeping your technology up to speed, it's really important to have leaders who focus on security and privacy as an important aspect of the company overall. If I'm a line level employee and I'm getting messages from my manager or someone at the top of the organization that are coming from that person's personal email, it's going to suggest to me that it's not really necessary to use the company email. And so I think that having appropriate leadership really committed to these issues is another hallmark of those companies that are handling security well.
And that was the next question I was going to ask you, so I appreciate you taking that on. What can be done contractually to protect a company as a vendor, and what about the vendee? Dani, I will stick with you on that one.
Okay, so in terms of contractual issues, we generally look at if you've got somebody who's handling your information or information that belongs to individuals within your company, it's important to look at both the measures, the security measures that the vendor is going to be taking to protect the confidentiality of that information, and it should be in accordance with any regulatory matters or statutory matters. So if it's educational information, it should be maintained in compliance with FERPA. If it's medical information, obviously HIPAA applies. So it's looking at the regulatory scheme and making sure that built into those contract are provisions that ensure that any organizations that are going to have access to that kind of confidential information of your company or your employees is appropriately protected. And then the other issue is to look at indemnification provisions, and these are often areas, or damages provisions. These are often areas where there can be substantial dispute. It's not uncommon for a vendor to say, or want to say, our liability will be limited to 2 months of your subscription cost, or whatever their standard clause may be. And that in many instances is just simply not going to be sufficient for the purchaser. So looking at those provisions, is the vendor actually taking reasonable measures to protect the information that's being shared, and the indemnification provision are the two that I generally look at most closely, because they're very important to ensuring the success of the relationship on an ongoing basis.
I'll open this up to all three of you. Takeaways, the important messages that you want people to remember from this conversation. Matt?
Yeah, my biggest takeaway is remove the attitude of, I haven't needed this for the last 20 years and I've been successful, from your talk track, because this world is evolving on a daily basis. It happens to real people with 2 employees to 2,000 employees all the time. It's real. It's not a made-up thing. So don't be caught unprotected when so much is available to you, in this time.
Chris, what do you think?
I'd say a couple different things. Is statistically 50% of businesses experienced a malware attack last year. People don't believe that this can happen to them. People don't believe that their employees could fall for a social engineering claim. I had a manufacturing customer that was contacted regarding a wire transfer. They started the process, but then realized that something was wrong in the equation and paused on it, turned it into the FBI, and the FBI came back and said that not only do they know who this attack was from, but they have recognized that they've already stolen $215 million from corporations in the past 12 months. So even though you think no one is going to be silly enough to just wire funds to another organization without knowing exactly that it's a viable invoice or contract. It's happening, and it's happening frequently. And then last thing I wanted to kind of say is the cost per record right now is $242 per record in 2019. So all it takes is about 4,200 records for you to hit $1 million in cost related to a cyber incident or breach. It's a substantial figure, and it's something that businesses should be prepared for.
Danielle, takeaways?
So I think probably the first thing that I focus on is trying to encourage individual employees to pause before they react. We saw many instances, like Chris is talking about, where either somebody in accounts payable gets a request to make a payment in response to something, and for whatever reason it is described as being particularly exigent, and they start to process that, wanting to be responsive to an email that looks like it has actually come from the CFO or the CEO. Generally, that best case scenario in those situations is first of all to look at the email and make sure it really is the CFO or CEO's email, and many times they're not. I mean, they'd be things that would say things like Dani Vanderzanden, CEO at yahoo.com. And if you'd actually opened it up, you'd have realized that that wasn't from my Ogletree account. Also, in instances where we're talking about substantial transactions, pick up the phone. Make sure that the request that's being made is actually coming from the person it's allegedly coming from. So although we're all trying to operate under very challenging circumstances in COVID-19, taking a moment to evaluate the authenticity of any of these requests is certainly a critical way to evaluate what's occurring and whether reacting in the way that the request has been posed is actually appropriate. I'm going to echo what both Matt and Chris said. I think a lot of organizations and a lot of the individuals, right? Organizations act through individuals. So feel like this isn't going to happen to me. We've taken appropriate steps. We've been really careful. We update our software on a daily basis. We've built encryption into our system, whatever. These things do happen to very highly sophisticated companies, and they happen on a regular basis. So being sucked into that notion that this is not going to happen to us is very counterproductive. I would also say that, as I mentioned a moment ago, I don't think change occurs without very effective leadership at the top. So there's got to be executive buy-in and sponsorship on these efforts. And it's really important, particularly in the midst of COVID-19, when there's so many additional vectors for cybersecurity intrusion as a result of the largely deployed to the home workforce. And then finally, certainly, working with trusted outside advisors to ensure that your legal compliance, your policies, I guess the other thing that I have, if I haven't said it already, is really critical. You can have the best policy in the world. If nobody follows it, it's of no value to you. And that's why that executive leadership at the top is also really important. So make sure that you are looking at what needs to be done within your organization and your industry, write it up, and then make sure you do it and push it down from the very top to the bottom. Otherwise, it's not going to be effective.
And I see, thank you for all of your thoughts and your comments there as we start to wrap this up. I see that some, sorry, that's my alarm. It's always an adventure here in my house. I see some of you have been working to answer questions by some of the people here in the chat. And I think one that was interesting and can apply to a lot of people that I think I'd like you all to chime in on is somebody was asking, what do the scams look like? And I think they're really wide reaching. I mean, I get emails about people who are being scammed all the time, but it kind of really just depends on what they're after, right? I mean, we talk about the unemployment scams, that's one issue, but the cybersecurity scams are completely different. I think that's why it's so important to have somebody with expertise, don't you think, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just the people, it's the tools. So a lot of these, a lot of the hacks, so I'll give you an example of one that comes through pretty often. An email will look like it's coming from the CEO or CFO to you, And it might be very innocuous, like Hank, what time are you going to be in the office today, or something like that. Very simple. They're not digging far. And what they're doing is they're just trying to find a starting point to start a conversation to kind of lure you in to think that this conversation's okay. The only problem with the conversation is that it is your boss's email address pretty close. It might be, Bill at WXYZ. And instead of it being WXYZ, it might say VVXYZ, okay, which to your eye looks like WXYZ. So the challenge there is that it looks just like it, but it's not it. So the technologies that are out there, the anti-phishing technologies, will pick up on that because they actually have artificial intelligence built in. One, to know, does Bill really email Hank all that often? To know, does this already look fishy from the beginning, no pun intended, to then digging in and saying, oh no, those are two V's, that's not a W. We're gonna flag this, we're gonna actually quarantine it. And so that's just a simple example, but that is an example of what a phishing attack might start off by looking like.
I've also seen, the social engineering has become really sophisticated, and that's a very good way to get into people. So for instance, we had a client who had just made some major changes within their office space. Now, this was before COVID, but had made some major changes within their office space. And what came out looked like a survey. Are you happy with the size of the refrigerator? What do you think of the coffee selection? Do you think we should have more snacks? Some other question, all very consistent, looking exactly like it would have to do with the renovation that they had just performed. And then the last piece said, to confirm that you're Dani Vanderzanden, put in your user ID and your password. Now, hopefully your employees already know that putting in your user ID and your password is not something that anybody at Ogletree Deakins would ever ask. But for this client, there were a number of people who didn't realize that putting in the user ID and the password was not required. First of all, that it wasn't a real survey, but let's ignore that for the moment. But putting in the user ID and the password was not required in order to be able to submit your information in response to this survey. And then when they put that in, that information, because they didn't have different passwords for certain components of the tech system within the organization, was able to be used to then divert their paychecks to a whole nother account. So folks were logging in and changing it from, and these people all showed up on payday when they didn't get their checks and said, why didn't you pay me? Well, we actually did pay you, and here's the proof of deposit to XYZ account. Well, I've never had an account at XYZ Bank. So they can be very sophisticated, and the social engineering piece is a piece to watch very closely.
I'm really tired of hearing about WXYZ. and as we wrap things up, I'll encourage you all to go to WDIV. To click on Detroit.com. I'll tell you why. We have many interviews with our security expert, Matt Loria, who we use often to help.
Never again, though, after I've botched.
To help navigate, the everyday Detroiter through a lot of security issues that so many people are dealing with, and it is a new reality now that so many of us are working from home and having to deal with a whole new set of cybersecurity challenges. So there are many, many stories that you can share with your friends, your colleagues, your family members that click on Detroit.com. So I appreciate all of you for your time, your insight. Matt, Danielle, Chris, thank you very much for participating. And thank you to all of you for listening in and being part of the conversation.